Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Let's do it.
Okay, so today we're digging into some confidential stuff, excerpts from a report by Jamaica's Integrity Commission, and this one goes all the way to the top, involving Prime Minister Andrew Holness.
Yeah, this isn't just your run-of-the-mill financial review. And the
Yeah.
fact that we have access to this kind of confidential report, well, it makes you wonder what they were looking for, right?
Exactly. It really piques your curiosity. So, from what I gather, the Integrity Commission got a tip. Something triggered not one, but two separate investigations into Mr. Holness's financial dealings.
Two. Yeah.
Two. And that's what we're going to unpack today. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, though, can you give us a quick rundown on Jamaica's Integrity Commission? What's their role? What kind of power do they actually have?
They're like financial watchdogs, essentially. They operate under the Corruption Prevention Act, and their main goal is to ensure transparency and accountability, especially from public officials. That means they're not just looking at tax returns. They can investigate the source of funds, dig into potential conflicts of interest. It's serious stuff.
So, they have teeth. They're not afraid to use them.
Not at all. They have a lot of authority to demand answers and make sure everything is above board.
And in this case, it seems like Mr. Holness's initial disclosures raised enough red flags to warrant a much closer look, right?
Yeah, they definitely saw something that made them want to dig deeper. One of the first things that stood out in the report was that Mr. Holness had some omissions in his statutory declarations. Specifically, there were several bank accounts that weren't disclosed.
Okay, now, I get that these declarations are legal documents and all, but we've all forgotten a detail on a form here and there. What makes these omissions so important, especially for someone in his position?
It goes back to that idea of public trust. These declarations exist for a reason. They're supposed to ensure transparency, and any omission, whether it was intentional or not, raises concerns. In Jamaica, making false statements on these declarations carries some pretty serious legal consequences because it undermines the whole system.
So it's not just about ticking boxes, it's about upholding the integrity of the office.
Exactly. It's a big deal.
Okay, so we've got these undisclosed bank accounts. That's already a bit of a head-scratcher. But then, as we go deeper into the report, it uncovers this whole web of companies connected to Mr. Holness, each with its own little quirks. For example, there's AdMat Incorporated. What struck me about this one is that it was incorporated in St. Lucia, not Jamaica. Why go offshore?
Yeah. While it's not entirely unheard of, it definitely raises an eyebrow or two. Offshore jurisdictions often have much stricter privacy laws, which makes it harder to track the money trail,
So more secrecy.
potentially.
Nah.
And that's something the Integrity Commission would want to clarify. Was there a legitimate business purpose for this offshore incorporation, or was it something more strategic?
Right, because there's a big difference there.
Absolutely. And it's their job to find out.
Okay, so we've got this offshore company, AdMat. And then it gets even more interesting because the report highlights AdMat's successor, Imperium Investments Holdings Limited, which apparently holds a big chunk of Mr. Holness's assets. Is this standard operating procedure? Or could this be, a way to make things a little less transparent?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? See, companies are considered separate legal entities, distinct from the actual owners. It's a concept called separate legal personality, and it's not inherently a bad thing.
So you can use it for legitimate reasons.
Exactly. Asset protection, business purposes, things like that. However, like many things in the financial world, it can also be exploited to blur the lines of ownership, make those financial dealings a bit murkier.
Right, so not necessarily a smoking gun, but definitely something that needs further investigation. And as if things weren't already complicated enough, we have another company entering the picture, Estate Bridge Development Limited. This one supposedly received a property transfer from, get this, AdMat. And the kicker, the property was sold for way less than market value. I mean, that sounds like a steal. How does something like that even happen?
Yeah, that particular transaction definitely caught the attention of the investigators. They'd want to scrutinize every detail of that valuation process.
Yeah.
Was it above board? Was there any undue influence involved?
Especially considering that government agencies could have been involved, right?
Exactly. That just adds another layer of complexity.
And this leads us to the heart of the matter, the actual financial discrepancies themselves. We're talking big sums of money flowing between Mr. Holness's personal accounts and these companies, often with explanations that don't quite add up. This is where it starts to feel like a financial thriller.
It really does. And
Yeah.
this is where forensic accounting, particularly what's called source and application of funds analysis, comes into play.
Okay, break that down for us. What does that actually mean?
Essentially, investigators become financial detectives. They meticulously track the origin and destination of every single dollar. Bank statements, loan documents, property records. They scrutinize everything to see if the numbers tell a consistent story.
So they're looking for inconsistencies, anything that seems out of place.
Exactly. They want to see if the puzzle pieces fit.
And in Mr. Holness's case, did those pieces fit?
Well, let's just say they found some transactions that raised a few eyebrows. For example, there were these large sums moving between Mr. Holness's personal accounts and those of his companies. And the explanations provided, let's just say they didn't quite align with the transactions themselves. And then there's the whole issue of Positive Media Solutions Limited and its connection to a company called Green Emerald.
Positive Media Solutions, right? That was the one that was supposedly funded by Imperium. But you mentioned something about the money trail not quite adding up.
Yeah, so the report, it shows that Positive Media, while it was supposed to be getting funds from Imperium, also had all these unexplained surplus funds just appearing in its account. And these funds, they're described as loans, coming from a company called Green Emerald.
Green Emerald. That name doesn't ring a bell.
And that's the thing. Green Emerald is a bit of a mystery. The report doesn't really shed much light on who they are or what their connection is to Positive Media.
So we have a mystery company injecting funds into a company that's linked to the Prime Minister, starting to feel like a real-life house of cards over here.
Right, and this is exactly the kind of intricate detail that investigators latch onto. What's the nature of Green Emerald's relationship with Positive Media? Why these substantial loans? Where did Green Emerald's funds even originate? These are all questions that warrant, well, further digging.
Yeah, because on the surface, it doesn't exactly look squeaky clean.
Let's just say it raises some serious red flags.
Okay, so we've got these questionable transactions, this mysterious company, Green Emerald. Is there more?
Oh, there's more. The report also mentions that several of these companies, including some we've already talked about, filed nil tax returns.
Nil tax returns. For those of us who aren't fluent in tax jargon, what does that even mean?
Basically, it means declaring zero income, no profit, no loss.
But weren't we just talking about all this money flowing through these companies?
Exactly. And that's the red flag. If these companies were generating revenue, as the financial transactions seem to indicate, then filing nil tax returns, well, it could point to potential tax evasion.
And that's a big no-no, right?
Big no-no for anyone, but especially for companies associated with high-ranking government officials.
Right, because it goes back to that whole integrity thing we were talking about. So let's recap for a second. We've got undisclosed bank accounts, offshore incorporations, questionable property deals, potentially suspicious loans, and now the possibility of tax evasion. What kind of legal hot water are we talking about here for Mr. Holness?
Well, the potential consequences, they're significant. Tax evasion, depending on the scale and the intent, could lead to hefty fines, penalties, maybe even criminal charges.
Wow. And I imagine the fact that these allegations involve companies linked to the Prime Minister doesn't exactly help matters.
Not at all. It adds a whole other layer of seriousness to the situation.
It's like the stakes just keep getting higher. And it's not just the legal ramifications, right? There's the whole court of public opinion to consider.
Absolutely. Public trust, transparency, integrity of the office, all of that comes into play here.
Because ultimately, it makes you question, if this is what they found, what else might be out there? Did the Integrity Commission ever come to any conclusions about Mr. Holness's involvement in all of this?
So as of the report's date, which is August 2024, they hadn't reached any definitive conclusions about Mr. Holness's direct involvement or his intent. Remember, this report is just a snapshot in time. It's a glimpse into an ongoing investigation.
Then we're left hanging a bit, with more questions than answers.
In a way, yes, we see this intricate web of financial dealings, we see the red flags, but there's no smoking gun, at least not yet.
So what happens now? What are the next steps?
Well, the report recommends stricter regulations for parliamentarians and public officials engaged in financial activities. Trying to prevent these situations from happening in the first place. But whether that's enough to change behavior, well, that's a whole other question.
Right, because rules are one thing, but actually enforcing them and creating a culture of accountability, that's a whole other challenge.
Exactly. It's about more than just having rules. It's about fostering an environment where those rules are actually respected and followed.
It's a tough nut to crack, right? Because you can put all these regulations in place, but is that really going to change anything?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, regulations are important, they set the boundaries, but they can't anticipate every possible scenario. And they definitely can't force people to act ethically.
Right. It's like they always say, rules are meant to be broken.
Well, let's hope not in this case. But it does highlight the need for a more holistic approach. You need strong oversight bodies like the Integrity Commission for sure, but you also need to promote financial literacy among public officials. Make sure they understand the rules and the consequences for breaking them.
And probably just as important, you need a culture where people are encouraged to hold their leaders accountable, right?
Absolutely. It's about creating a system where transparency is expected, not just demanded after the fact.
It takes a village, as they say.
It really does.
So we talked about the nil tax returns and the potential for tax evasion. Were there any other big question marks left hanging in the report, things that really stood out to you?
Yeah, one of the biggest unresolved issues was this question of potential conflicts of interest. The report specifically looked at whether Mr. Holness personally benefited from his position, especially when it came to estate bridge and those dealings with government agencies we talked about earlier.
Right, that property transfer, the one where Estate Bridge gave such a favorable price.
Exactly. The report couldn't say for sure whether there was any wrongdoing, but it definitely pointed to the possibility of undue influence. And that's something that would need a much deeper dive to untangle.
And who knows what they might find if they keep digging.
That's the thing about these investigations. They often uncover more questions than answers, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just shows us where the vulnerabilities are, where the system needs to be strengthened.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Jamaica's political landscape, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they remember about this case, even with all its loose ends?
I think the key message here is the importance of transparency and accountability. And that's not just in Jamaica, but everywhere. This investigation, regardless of how it ultimately plays out, it reminds us that no one is above scrutiny, especially those in positions of power.
Well said. We need strong oversight, clear regulations, and citizens who are engaged and willing to ask tough questions.
Couldn't agree more.
So there you have it, folks. A glimpse into the world of high finance and political intrigue, Jamaican style. We dug into a confidential report, uncovered some eyebrow-raising transactions, and explored the power of forensic accounting. Remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. The investigation is ongoing, and we'll be sure to keep you updated as more information comes to light. In the meantime, don't be afraid to do your own digging. Read the report, explore the source material, and form your own conclusions. Until next time, stay curious.